let's talk a little bit more about etiology, the etiology of these conditions. And I'm aware that when we begin to talk about the possible causes of these disorders, we're kind of implying that there is legitimacy to these disorders, which is already, and it's an assumption that I don't think either of us actually embrace. So that gets very tricky. Like, one of the things, I did a dissertation and I ended up looking into schizophrenia very closely and how it has evolved throughout the editions of the DSM, and interviewed people who had schizophrenia. And one of the things I came away with realizing was just how much diversity there is within the population of people who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia. To think that there would be one cause, or even a set of causes that applies to all of these very different cases who are all under the same label, is simply erroneous. Because when you look at the criteria for any condition, there's always a variety of things, and people have to meet some minimum number of, let's say, 8 criteria. They'll have to meet 3 or 4 of them, right? And so given that makes room for so much heterogeneity among people with the same exact condition, which makes it almost impossible to ever find a cause of that condition, or again, a set of consistent contributing factors. So I say that as a qualifier as we enter the territory now of discussing etiology. We know that it's not a chemical imbalance. That is not to be taken seriously anymore. As Peter Gutsch said on this podcast, that theory is stone dead. And unfortunately, that has not been made public enough. So we're doing our part right now to make that public. But I think the common person who doesn't study this stuff has heard of the chemical imbalance theory and takes it for granted. So we know that's not a legitimate etiological explanation of any of these conditions. But I want to know your thoughts on what you think some of the contributing factors are, some of the potential causes are for people's emotional struggles and for these conditions that get diagnosed as.
Well, I think one of the maybe easier areas for us to talk about in 5 or 10 minutes here, that people are very much familiar with, these attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and these so-called disruptive disorders of childhood, this oppositional defiant disorder symptoms, often argue with adults, often refuse to comply with adults, the ADHD, kids not paying attention, hyperactive, impulsive, etc. So people are real familiar with that. And just again, forget about psychiatry, for example. Just think about these behaviors and just think about what are the kind of, what should be, I was going to say common sense, but it's not so common anymore, but just logical reasons why a young person might move into being disruptive, being attentionally non-compliant, being behaviorally non-compliant. I can rattle off many, okay? And I'll just throw off a few. One is a feeling of powerlessness, okay? So if you feel power, now some people, some human beings are more in tune, more sensitive to a need for power than others. So there's certainly some kids could stay seated in a classroom and in a family and have no power, and they're not going to wig out. It's not that big a deal for them for whatever reason. But for a lot of human beings, the sense of having zero power over your life is an incredibly uncomfortable feeling. So powerlessness. Boredom is another reason why. Now, people hear young kids say over and over again, I'm bored, and they don't take it seriously. I do. I remember how boring it was to be in most of my classrooms. And again, for a lot of kids, that feeling of boredom is intolerable. For some folks, a lot of these folks end up becoming teachers or shrinks or something like that. They can handle boredom real well. I don't know, so they don't realize, they don't call that an illness, the fact that they can handle boredom too well. But for a lot of other folks, they can't. And I don't see that as a disease, that you can't handle boredom. It's just, and another reasons why that people for a lot of people that they are behaving disruptively because they have resentment. They have a sense of injustice. Something went on that they feel is unfair. So we could go on. Obviously, other obvious things. People didn't have enough sleep. They didn't have they're not getting enough sleep. So many of these kids are getting diagnosed with ADHD, are getting not enough sleep. They're not eating the way they should be eating. They're not exercising. There's some really obvious stuff that causes it. A lot of other reasons that they're feeling maybe some trauma in their life. Maybe they had their parents are going through a horrible divorce, and that overwhelming pain is so dominating their brain that they can't pay attention to anything. So we could go on and on and on. I've given you 4 or 5. I'm sure we could come up with 10 at least between the two of us. But I think the important thing is when you stop looking at these behaviors that create tension as diseases, you stop medicalizing them, diseasing them, pathologizing them, and you start using your critical thinking, using your brain to try to understand, then you're going to really be helpful. Because you think about it for yourself, Nick, I know for myself, is like if I was doing some stuff that was creating tension, whether it was being depressed, not paying attention, acting crazy, what would we want? We'd want somebody who was curious, right? We'd want compassion. We'd want curiosity. We'd want somebody who wasn't sitting around trying to figure out whether this guy's bipolar disorder, they're schizophrenic, they're schizoaffective. Who the hell would want something like that? We'd want somebody trying to figure out why the hell are you being that way and having some compassion for us. And that would be key. And that just doesn't go on. We know that doesn't go on in mental health, but it certainly doesn't go on in psychiatry. 95% of these guys are just doing these medical managements. They're just checking people's symptoms and tweaking their medication. And unfortunately, there used to be a bigger divide among clinical psychologists and psychiatrists, but unfortunately, that gap is closed a lot, and they don't think as differently as psychiatry anymore. So that's sad for me, because once upon a time, psychologists, this wasn't as radical. The stuff that I was talking about right now, it wasn't anywhere near as radical as it may sound today.